Texas, summer of 1944. The sun climbs over the flat horizon, spilling gold across endless rows of mesquite and dry grass. A light breeze stirs the dust along a dirt road that leads to a place surrounded by barbed wire and wooden towers. Camp Hearn, one of hundreds of prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the American heartland. A guard adjusts his helmet, squinting toward the compound. It's early. Too early. Yet the sound begins again. Laughter. It rolls through the morning air. Deep, booming, genuine laughter. German voices. Inside the camp, dozens of prisoners sit in the yard, some shirtless under the heat, others hammering wood or sketching on scraps of paper. One man strums a guitar, another juggles tin cups. A few are rehearsing a play, a parody of their American guards. The guards themselves, leaning on rifles, glance at each other. Half amused, half bewildered, in the middle of a world still burning in Europe, these men, once feared soldiers of Hitler's army, laugh louder than their captors. But how did they end up here, in the land of their enemies, finding joy behind wire? The story of the laughter inside America's prisoner-of-war camps begins far from Texas. It begins in the deserts of North Africa, where the German Afrika Korps, once the pride of Hitler's overseas forces, finally met defeat. By May 1943, the Allied armies under General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had crushed Axis resistance in Tunisia. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered, a staggering number that shocked both sides. The victorious Allies suddenly faced a logistical nightmare: where to hold this vast army of captives. Britain was already overcrowded, its resources stretched thin by years of bombing and rationing. The solution came from across the Atlantic. The United States, still relatively untouched by war on its own soil, offered space, security, and supplies. It would soon become home to nearly 500,000 Axis prisoners, the majority of them German. Between 1942 and 1945, over 425,000 German POWs were shipped in convoys across the Atlantic, landing at ports like Norfolk, New York, and New Orleans before being dispersed to more than 700 camps spread across 46 states. They arrived in silence, bound in chains, under the eyes of armed American guards. Most were stunned by the sheer scale of the country they had been taught to hate, the vast railways, clean towns, and the abundance of food even during wartime. For many, this was their first glimpse of the enemy's homeland. The camps themselves were built with remarkable speed. In Texas, Camp Hearn, Camp Huntsville, and Camp Mexia rose on farmlands once used for cattle and cotton. Barracks were simple wooden structures with tin roofs, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. The men slept on bunks, ate in mess halls, and worked under the supervision of the U.S. Army's prisoner-of-war division. But beneath this strict military order, something unexpected began to unfold. The Geneva Convention of 1929, signed by both Germany and the United States, required that prisoners be treated humanely. They were to receive proper food, medical care, and even pay for their labor. In practice, this meant that German POWs in America often lived better than many civilians in war-torn Europe, and sometimes even better than the Americans guarding them, who were paid less and ate simpler meals. It was an irony no one missed. At first, American towns near the camps were uneasy. Rumors spread that the prisoners were dangerous, fanatical Nazis. Parents warned their children not to approach the fences. Farmers feared sabotage. But when local men were drafted and labor shortages hit hard, the War Department began allowing POWs to work on farms and in factories, under guard. Of course, they picked cotton, cut timber, harvested wheat, canned fruit, and built roads. They earned small wages, 80 cents a day, credited to their accounts, and often received better meals than the civilians beside them. Gradually, the barriers of fear began to thin. Local newspapers reported that the Germans work hard, sing often, and cause no trouble. Farmers brought them lemonade in the fields. Some Americans exchanged letters or traded cigarettes through the wire, technically forbidden, but quietly tolerated. To many guards, the men inside the fences didn't look like monsters anymore. They looked like soldiers, weary, far from home, stripped of ideology by defeat. The German prisoners themselves were divided. Some remained fiercely loyal to Hitler. Others were simply grateful to be alive, far from the killing fields of Europe. Many were young, barely 20, who had never questioned the cause they fought for until now. By late 1943, the camps had begun to evolve into small, self-contained worlds. There were libraries, sports fields, workshops, and classrooms. The Germans requested instruments, built theaters, and organized orchestras. American officers, bound by the Geneva Convention, approved many of these requests, believing it would maintain order and morale. They were right. The laughter and music that filled the air each evening weren't acts of rebellion. They were survival. From North Africa to the American plains, the men who had once marched under Rommel's sun-baked banners were now hammering nails into stage sets, learning English and writing home about the strange kindness of our enemies. What began as a wartime necessity was turning into something no one had anticipated, a quiet social experiment in the heart of America. And as the camps grew more organized, so did life inside them. Routines, rituals, even joy. By late 1943, life inside America's prisoner of war camps had settled into rhythm, a strange, almost peaceful routine, utterly unlike the chaos the men had left behind in Europe. Each morning began with réveillé at dawn. Prisoners lined up for roll call, hundreds of uniforms now faded to tan from the Texas dust. The smell of coffee drifted through the mess halls, real coffee, not the ersatz grain substitute they'd grown used to in the Reich. Breakfasts of eggs, sausage, and white bread stunned men who remembered the rationing of home. By 7, the work details departed through the gates under armed escort. Those assigned to nearby farms rode in the backs of army trucks, singing German folk songs as they passed through quiet American towns. Others stayed behind to work in carpentry shops, tailoring rooms, or bakeries. Within the wire, a miniature world had taken shape, a world that seemed to exist outside the war entirely. At Camp Hearn, one of Texas's largest installations, the Germans built a theater from scrap wood and cardboard. They painted backdrops of castles and forests, sewed costumes from flour sacks, and staged everything from Faust to comedies that mocked both Hitler's speeches and their American guards. The guards themselves would sometimes watch from outside the fence, trying not to laugh. In Camp Mexia, orchestras performed Bach and Brahms on makeshift instruments. At night, their music floated across the prairie, haunting, beautiful, and impossibly out of place. Some guards admitted years later that they would pause their patrols just to listen. The Geneva Convention had also required that prisoners be allowed education and recreation. American officers, seeking discipline through dignity, permitted the Germans to organize schools, lectures, and even newspapers. Classes in English, mathematics, and philosophy were taught by former professors and engineers. Within months, thousands of prisoners were attending daily lessons, a strange kind of university behind barbed wire. To maintain morale, the camps distributed the POW News, an English-language newspaper edited under supervision. Inside the compounds, German-language papers flourished too, filled with stories, sketches, and jokes, carefully censored but still humorous. Work, learning, and art. It was all part of a deliberate U.S. strategy. Keep the prisoners busy, and they'll stay calm. But it had another effect. It humanized the enemy. Many guards came from small towns and farms, just like the men they watched. They realized that most prisoners weren't die-hard Nazis. They were conscripts, young men swept into war. Over time, small acts of trust began to appear. A guard would hand a German prisoner his rifle to fix a jammed bolt. A farmer would leave the men unguarded for lunch, knowing they wouldn't run. The result was something few could have predicted: friendship. Letters smuggled out of the camps often spoke of the good Americans. One soldier from Bavaria wrote, "We came here expecting hatred. Instead, they give us books, music, and work." I do not know if I could have treated them the same, but beneath this harmony lay quiet tensions. Not all prisoners accepted defeat with grace. Hidden among the ordinary soldiers were fanatical Nazis, men of the Schwarz, or Black Guard, who enforced ideological purity within the compounds. They kept lists of traitors and punished those who mocked the Reich too openly. For most, however, daily life continued in uneasy peace. Baseball games were organized between German teams and American guards. Prisoners carved model ships or painted landscapes of home. They traded handmade trinkets with townspeople for tobacco and chocolate, and through it all, the laughter persisted. Former guards would later recall it vividly. "They laughed louder than we did," one said. "You'd think they had won the war." Perhaps that laughter was defiance. Perhaps it was disbelief, a reaction to the absurdity of finding comfort in captivity. Or maybe, after years of marching, bombing, and fear, it was the first time many had felt safe. In a world where every nation was burning, the POW camps became a strange sanctuary, a place where enemies shared jokes across fences and humanity flickered back to life. But that fragile peace would not last forever. Beneath the songs, beneath the laughter, darker forces were stirring: ideological cracks, secret killings, and the realization that not every prisoner wanted peace. The laughter, for some, would soon be silenced by fear. By 1944, the barbed wire no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a border between two versions of the same humanity. On one side stood the guards in khaki. On the other, the prisoners in faded field gray. Both were young. Both were tired of war. What began as duty and discipline soon gave way to quiet understanding. Many of the guards at camps like Herne, Mexia, and Huntsville were not career soldiers. They were National Guardsmen, older men, or those unfit for overseas combat. To them, the war was distant. They had never seen the front, only heard of it in radio broadcasts and letters. Watching the Germans every day, they realized these prisoners weren't fanatics shouting Sieg Heil. They were human beings shaving, cooking, singing, and missing home. Guards often described a strange moment of recognition when the enemy became just another man trying to survive. There are countless accounts of quiet friendships, forming, never official, never publicized. A guard slipping a German prisoner an extra cup of coffee during winter. A prisoner carving a wooden toy and handing it through the wire for a guard's child. One Texan recalled years later, "We watched them play soccer in the evenings. They'd cheer and laugh, and it was hard to remember that these same men might have shot at us overseas." Somewhere between the laughter and the fences, we stopped seeing them as Nazis. They were just boys far from home. The POWs too began to see their captors differently. They were stunned by American abundance, the calm efficiency of the guards, and the sheer lack of cruelty. Most had been raised on Nazi propaganda that painted Americans as morally weak and racially impure. Yet here they were, being treated with dignity by the enemy. Many prisoners would later write that their time in America shattered their faith in Nazi ideology. It was not through lectures or punishment, but through simple acts of fairness. The bond extended beyond the camps. Local families working alongside POWs in the fields shared food and laughter, and sometimes cautiously, conversation. One farmer's wife recalled, "They'd sing while they picked cotton. Songs I didn't understand but sounded like home. They'd wave to my kids through the truck windows." We stopped being afraid. Even the American Red Cross noted the unusually positive morale inside the camps. Inspectors reported excellent discipline and remarkable cooperation. The laughter that echoed from within wasn't rebellion, it was release. These men had survived Africa, Italy, and the Atlantic crossings. For the first time, they were free from the bombs, from hunger, from ideology. They laughed because, in an impossible way, they felt safe, guarded by their enemies, but safe nonetheless. But there was another, quieter reason for that laughter, one that unfolded every night, when the camp transformed from a military prison into something far stranger. When the gates closed at dusk, the German prisoners built something astonishing, a living, breathing echo of the world they had lost. At Camp Herne, prisoners established what they called Die Kleinstadt, the little town. There was a bakery, a cobbler's shop, a barber, a tailor, and even a cafe that served ersatz coffee brewed from roasted chicory. The men built furniture, painted signs, and traded handmade goods for cigarettes or favors. They staged concerts, cabarets, and theater productions, full performances with costumes, lighting, and orchestras. One of the most famous was a comedy titled The Barber of Herne, a satire mocking both their guards and the absurdity of war. American officers, amused, often attended as spectators. Theatrical life flourished so much that the camp earned a nickname among nearby towns, the Fritz Ritz. In Camp Mexia, musicians formed a symphony orchestra with instruments donated by local citizens. They played everything from Wagner to jazz, the latter technically forbidden in Nazi Germany. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Theater and music weren't the only escapes. Camp libraries were stocked with German classics, philosophy, and newly translated American novels. Thousands of prisoners devoured works by Mark Twain, Hemingway, and Steinbeck, discovering in fiction what they couldn't express in words, that the world was larger and more complex than any ideology. Sports fields, too, became stages of laughter and rivalry. Soccer was king. Matches drew crowds from nearby towns, and American teams even challenged the Germans on weekends. Locals would come to watch, bringing children who stared wide-eyed at the strange scene, their enemies, laughing, sweating, shouting, and celebrating goals like any hometown team. The U.S. Army encouraged these activities. They knew morale meant control, but they didn't expect what would follow, how the cultural life of the camps would begin to melt suspicion outside the fences. In Herne, prisoners' artwork was exhibited in local schools. In Huntsville, their carpentry work repaired farmhouses and churches. Townspeople began to admire their craftsmanship and discipline. The Germans were no longer faceless enemies. They were artisans, musicians, teachers, and slowly, something even deeper emerged: mutual respect. A guard at Camp Mexia once said, "They had their pride, even in defeat." We respected that. They worked hard, they laughed harder. Sometimes it was hard to remember who was guarding whom. By 1944, life inside these camps had taken on a surreal duality: war raging overseas, yet within the fences, laughter, theater, learning, and music. It was, in many ways, a world turned upside down, where the defeated found joy, and the victors found reflection. But not all Germans accepted this peace. In the shadows of this strange harmony, whispers began to spread. Accusations of betrayal, secret Nazi cells, and punishments for those who laughed too freely. The laughter that had once united them would soon divide them. Beneath the laughter and camaraderie, a darker undercurrent pulsed through every POW camp. The German army that surrendered to the Allies was not a single unified group of men. It was a fractured mirror of the Reich itself. Some were career soldiers, some were teenagers drafted in desperation, and some, a small but fierce minority, were fanatical believers in Hitler's cause. These men, often called the Blacks by fellow prisoners, were determined to maintain Nazi discipline even in defeat. To them, captivity did not end the war. It simply changed the battlefield. They organized secret cells inside the camps, mimicking the SS chain of command. They controlled the camp newspapers, censored letters, and punished those who spoke critically of the Führer or fraternized with Americans. Their weapons were not guns, but fear, threats, and ideology. In Camp Herne, informants quietly recorded who laughed at Nazi jokes, who read banned books, who played jazz. The cultural freedom that had once been celebrated now became dangerous. Prisoners who dared to question the Reich, or express gratitude to their captors, risked violent retaliation. Several were beaten. A few were murdered. The Americans, bound by the Geneva Convention, hesitated to interfere directly in internal German matters unless they had proof. One chilling case occurred in Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, in November 1943. A 22-year-old prisoner named Johannes Kunze was accused by fellow inmates of betraying escape plans to the Americans. That night, inside his barracks, he was brutally beaten to death by a group of Nazi loyalists. His body was found the next morning, covered with bruises and wrapped in a blanket. The U.S. Army launched an investigation. 8 men were eventually tried and hanged at Fort Leavenworth. But the message inside the camps was clear: the Reich still lived behind the wire. In the aftermath, the War Department began segregating hardline Nazis from moderate or anti-Nazi prisoners. New compounds were created for troublemakers, where loyalty to Hitler remained unbroken. Yet even among the moderates, guilt and confusion festered. Some prisoners clung to the last threads of national pride. Others wrestled with what they had seen. The concentration camps rumored in letters from home, the lies they had been told, the atrocities whispered about among captured officers. A few American chaplains began introducing re-education programs designed to expose the prisoners to democratic ideas. They screened newsreels showing the liberation of occupied towns and the destruction wrought by the Wehrmacht. The reactions were divided. Some wept quietly, others shouted that it was Allied propaganda. In that moral fog, the laughter that once rang across the campgrounds took on new meaning. It became a fragile act of defiance, not against America, but against despair. For many Germans, laughter was the only rebellion left. Against the war, against ideology, against the weight of guilt none of them yet fully understood. Inside those fences, between guilt and gratitude, something in them began to shift. To Americans living near the camps, the transformation was equally profound. At first, the idea of German soldiers living in the heart of their towns provoked outrage. Newspapers printed warnings, and rumors spread of Nazi escape plots and spies among us. In Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, petitions were filed to prevent new camps from being built. But when the first prisoners arrived, reality didn't match the fear. Locals saw polite, disciplined young men, often blonde, clean-cut, and well-mannered, not the propaganda caricatures of snarling stormtroopers. Townspeople quickly realized these men were here to work, not fight. Farmers, facing severe labor shortages as American men fought overseas, began to depend on POW labor. The arrangement was simple. The army provided the men, the farmers provided food, and everyone benefited. What surprised many was how the Germans worked, hard, skillfully, and often with pride. They sang as they harvested cotton, repaired fences, or stacked hay. American families would sometimes pack them lunches, and on rare occasions, invite them to eat on the porch. A few of those encounters led to lifelong friendships, secret at first, later celebrated. Letters exchanged after the war spoke of gratitude, kindness, and a shared humanity that transcended barbed wire. One Texas farmer wrote decades later, "They came as enemies, but I remember them as good men. They helped feed our town. They laughed more than any of us, maybe because they knew the war was over for them." The U.S. government took note. The success of the POW program, economically and socially, became a quiet triumph of American organization. Despite hosting hundreds of thousands of former enemy soldiers, there were virtually no major uprisings or riots. Still, not everyone approved. Veterans returning from Europe found it difficult to accept the sight of German prisoners being treated so well. Some saw it as an insult to fallen comrades. Others, hardened by combat, could not forget the horrors inflicted by the Wehrmacht across Europe. But time, routine, and proximity eroded hatred. The guards began to relax, the locals began to smile, and the laughter from inside the fences no longer felt threatening. It became part of the soundscape of small-town America, like the distant whistle of a freight train or the hum of cicadas at dusk. For a moment in history, the heart of wartime America became a paradox, a nation at war with Germany, yet hosting tens of thousands of Germans who lived, worked, and even laughed under its protection. In that contradiction lay something powerful, proof that even amid global hatred, decency could endure. But as 1944 turned to 1945, and news of the Reich's collapse began to reach the camps, the mood shifted once again. The laughter grew quieter. Men stared at the ground as they read of bombed cities, starving families, and Hitler's last desperate stand. The end of the war was near, and with it, the end of this strange, suspended world. Soon, the barbed wire would no longer divide victors and prisoners, but past and future. By the spring of 1944, the paradox of the American POW camps had reached its breaking point. On the surface, everything appeared orderly. German prisoners continued to work the fields, stage plays, and send censored letters home. Guards reported high morale, low escape rates, and model behavior. But beneath that calm exterior, the camps had begun to divide, not between prisoners and guards, but between Germans themselves. The laughter that once echoed through the compounds began to sound different. It was nervous now, measured, because among the thousands who smiled during roll call, some were watching. Within the barracks, the ideological lines hardened. The Black Guards, or Schwarze, remained fiercely loyal to Hitler. They believed that surrender was dishonor, that Germany's defeat in Africa and Italy was only temporary, and that the true believers would soon be rescued when the Reich's secret weapons, the V-2 rockets, the jet bombers, the Wunderwaffe, turned the tide. Their mission was clear: maintain Nazi discipline, even in captivity. Their enemy was no longer the Americans outside the fence. It was the Germans who had begun to doubt. At Camp Herne, several prisoners who refused to attend Nazi meetings or who fraternized with guards were branded traitors. Propaganda leaflets circulated among the men, warning that the Führer sees all. Late at night, hardline groups held secret gatherings in the barracks, complete with improvised flags and speeches. It was a chilling mirror of the Reich itself: hierarchy, fear, obedience. To the Americans watching from the towers, everything seemed calm. They heard laughter, music, and the occasional argument, but they couldn't see what was happening in the shadows of the huts. The camps, though guarded, were largely self-governed. According to the Geneva Convention, internal discipline was to be maintained by the prisoners' own officers. That autonomy gave the Nazis inside a kind of power, and they used it. In some camps, prisoners who expressed anti-Hitler opinions were beaten. In others, secret courts, Kameradschaftsgerichte, or comrades' courts, sentenced dissenters to death. The most infamous case came at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, in November 1943. The victim was Johannes Kunze, a young Luftwaffe mechanic who had been overheard praising the Americans and mocking Hitler. To the Schwarze, this was treason. That night, under the yellow glow of the barracks lights, Kunze was attacked by a mob of fellow prisoners. They beat him mercilessly with fists and boards, shouting, "Verräter!" a traitor, until he fell silent. His body was hidden beneath his bunk and later found by U.S. guards. The Americans were stunned. They had believed their camps were peaceful, even humane. The murder shattered that illusion overnight. The investigation that followed was swift. The killers were identified, tried by a U.S. military tribunal, and executed by hanging at Fort Leavenworth in 1945. But the shock reverberated through every camp in the country. From that moment on, the U.S. Army began quietly dividing prisoners into three categories: hardcore Nazis, loyal to the Reich; organized, dangerous; moderates, apolitical soldiers, mostly conscripts; anti-Nazis, men openly opposed to Hitler. The segregation policy reduced violence, but it also exposed the deep fractures inside Germany's captured army. In Camp Herne, guards noticed the change immediately. The laughter at night grew muted. Plays and concerts were still performed, but fewer came to watch. Many prisoners stopped writing letters altogether, fearing they might be labeled traitors. Even music became political. Songs once sung freely were now whispered. Jazz, once a favorite among the younger soldiers, was banned by the camp's self-appointed Nazi leadership. And yet, even in this atmosphere of fear, small acts of resistance persisted. Some prisoners painted subtle symbols: a flower, a bird, a broken swastika, onto stage sets and murals. Quiet gestures of rebellion only a few could recognize. The American guards, unsure of how far to intervene, walked a narrow line. They didn't want to provoke riots, but they couldn't ignore the tension any longer. In reports to Washington, they began describing the situation in new terms. The enemy fights among themselves. The war continues inside the wire. For many of the guards, that realization was haunting. They had thought the war existed far away, in Europe, in the Pacific. But here, in these quiet camps surrounded by fields and rivers, the same forces of ideology and cruelty that had consumed a continent were playing out again, unseen by the world. By late 1944, the psychological weight was visible on both sides. The guards became stricter, the searches more frequent. Prisoners were warned against forming political groups. Camp newspapers were heavily censored. Still, the divide deepened. One prisoner later described it in his memoir: "We had two Germanys, one that still believed and one that wanted to forget." Between them stood fear. The laughter that had once symbolized peace now carried a strange echo, a nervous defiance. A reminder that even in captivity, war still lived within them. Outside the fences, the war itself was nearing its climax. The Allies were closing in on the Rhine. Berlin trembled under nightly bombing raids. And though the men inside these American camps could only read about it in fragments, they knew the end was near. They could feel it in the letters that stopped coming, in the faces of their guards, in the silence that began replacing laughter. And soon, one desperate act, a daring, chaotic escape attempt, would bring all the buried tensions to the surface. Winter, December 1944. Across Europe, Hitler's armies launched one last desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. In America's prisoner of war camps, news of the offensive spread like wildfire through the barracks. Suddenly, the dream of a German comeback, long buried under dust and resignation, flickered again. In the Arizona desert near Phoenix lay one of the largest and most isolated POW compounds in the United States, Camp Papago Park. Surrounded by sand, cactus, and barren hills, it held over 1,500 German naval prisoners, mostly U-boat officers and sailors captured in the Atlantic. They were proud, intelligent men, many still fiercely loyal to the Kriegsmarine and the Reich. Life in the camp followed the same pattern as in Texas: sports, lectures, and music. But under that routine, something secret was taking shape. For months, a small group of U-boat officers led by Captain Jürgen Wattenberg, once commander of U-162, had been planning an escape. They studied the camp's layout, the guards' schedules, and the desert beyond. To the Americans, they appeared disciplined and quiet. In truth, they were digging, inch by inch, night after night, beneath the camp's laundry room. The soil was hard and rocky. The tunnel stretched over 178 feet, reinforced with stolen wood, hidden by secret trapdoors, and ventilated through hollow pipes. It was a feat of engineering rivaling anything seen in wartime Europe. Their goal was simple: reach the Salt River, build makeshift boats, and sail to the Gulf of California, more than 130 miles away. From there, they believed they could find passage to neutral Mexico, and from there, perhaps, to freedom. By December 23, 1944, the tunnel was complete. That night, under the cold desert sky, 25 German POWs slipped quietly into the darkness. The guards didn't notice. The desert wind carried no sound but the crunch of boots and the distant howl of coyotes. It was the largest escape from a POW camp in American history. The news broke the next morning. Military police swarmed the area. Roadblocks were set up across Arizona. Locals armed themselves, expecting danger that never came. The Germans, exhausted and freezing, wandered through cactus fields and dry washes, some armed only with stolen maps and broken compasses. For days they hid in drainage ditches and abandoned barns, living on stolen oranges and canned milk. A few even knocked on doors asking for food, speaking broken English. Some locals helped them. Others turned them in. By New Year's Day 1945, all but one had been captured. The last, Captain Wattenberg himself, managed to evade search teams for over a month, hiding in desert caves before finally surrendering. No one had been harmed. No shots were fired. The great escape of Papago Park had ended not in glory, but in quiet futility. To the Americans, it was a bizarre episode, almost comical in its audacity. Newspapers joked that the Germans had tried to swim home, but to the prisoners, it was deadly serious. It was about pride, purpose, and the illusion that the war, and their loyalty, still meant something. When the escapees were returned to camp, something inside the others broke. The laughter that had once filled the compound now fell silent. They realized the truth they had been avoiding. There was no rescue coming, no victory waiting. Germany was collapsing, and they were powerless witnesses. As spring approached, the first confirmed reports of the fall of Berlin reached the camps. The Reich, they learned, had ceased to exist. Hitler was dead. The war was over. The reactions varied. Some cheered openly, tears in their eyes. Others fell into stunned silence. A few refused to believe it, muttering that Hitler had escaped, that Germany would rise again. But most simply sat in the dust, staring at the fences that had defined their world for years. One guard at Camp Hearn remembered it vividly. When we told them, they didn't speak for a long time. Then someone started singing quietly. Not a Nazi song, just a folk tune. Others joined in. It sounded like mourning. Across America, the war's end transformed the camps overnight. Flags were lowered. Work details were halted. Prisoners began to prepare for repatriation, but the joy they had once felt was gone. They had lived in a strange limbo, a world of laughter, art, and relative comfort. But now, freedom meant returning to a homeland reduced to rubble. Families were dead, cities erased. The Reich they had served was a ghost. For many, captivity had become a strange refuge, a place where humanity had survived, however imperfectly. Leaving it meant facing the full weight of what their country had done. Some prisoners destroyed their Nazi insignia before departure. Others burned homemade flags. A few asked to stay in America, not as soldiers, but as men who had discovered another kind of loyalty. The barbed wire that once symbolized defeat now represented something else entirely: safety, food, and the first faint understanding of peace. But history had moved on. The gates would soon open, and the laughter that once startled the guards of Texas, Oklahoma, and Arizona would fade into memory, replaced by the silence of ships crossing the Atlantic, carrying home men forever changed by their captivity. They had entered those camps as conquerors who had lost. They left as prisoners who had learned how to live. The end came quietly. No marching bands, no triumphant parades, just trains, convoys, and the low hum of diesel engines carrying thousands of German prisoners toward the ports. It was late 1945. Across the American South and Midwest, the camps that had once buzzed with life were now half empty. The laughter that once rolled across the Texas plains had faded into a kind of reflective calm. Orders from Washington were clear. All Axis prisoners would be processed for repatriation to Europe under Allied supervision. For the men behind the wire, the announcement stirred emotions they hadn't felt in years: excitement, fear, and grief all at once. After so long in captivity, many no longer knew what home meant. The process began in waves. Prisoners were transported by rail to East Coast embarkation ports, Norfolk, New York, and Newport News. The scenes were surreal. German soldiers, neat and disciplined, marching in formation under American flags, saluting U.S. officers they had once called the enemy. Each man received a physical examination, ration packs, and a final pay statement for his wartime labor. They were issued clean clothes, sometimes U.S. Army fatigues marked PW in large black letters, and escorted aboard transport ships. Bound for Europe, but not all ships sailed for Germany. In the shattered aftermath of the war, much of Germany was occupied and unprepared to receive hundreds of thousands of returning soldiers. The British and French zones were overcrowded. So many American-held prisoners were temporarily sent instead to Great Britain or France, where they worked for another year or more rebuilding what their armies had destroyed. For those who finally set foot on German soil, the shock was immediate and devastating. Cities they had known by name, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin, were unrecognizable. Streets once lined with houses were reduced to blackened ruins. Families were scattered or gone. Food was scarce. Jobs non-existent. The victorious Reich of their propaganda dreams had vanished, replaced by hunger, rubble, and silence. Many former POWs later described the return as a second imprisonment. Only this time, there were no fences, no guards, and no laughter. One man from Bavaria recalled stepping off the train. "We came home free men, but there was nothing left to be free for. My village was gone. My parents were dead. I wished for a moment to be back in America." For years afterward, letters would cross the Atlantic, from men who had once been prisoners, writing to the farmers and guards who had watched over them. They wrote in careful English, often beginning the same way. "Do you remember me?" Some sent gifts, wood carvings, photos, painted landscapes. A few even returned, legally this time, as immigrants in the 1950s, seeking to rebuild their lives in the same land that had once held them captive. For the Americans who had guarded them, the memory was equally strange. Many described a deep respect for the German POWs, their discipline, craftsmanship, and humor. Some small towns even held informal reunions decades later, when former prisoners revisited the camps that had changed their lives. The U.S. government, meanwhile regarded the POW program as a quiet success. Despite hosting nearly 425,000 prisoners, there had been no major uprisings, no large-scale violence, and remarkably few escapes. The system had cost money, yes, but it had also provided vital wartime labor, boosted rural economies, and offered a living testament to American adherence to the Geneva Convention. But beyond policy and politics, the camps had left behind something deeper, a moral imprint. For many of the Germans, captivity in the United States was the first time they had seen democracy, not as ideology, but as daily life. They saw freedom practiced, fairness enforced, and prejudice defied. They saw a society that could fight without hatred. Some later credited their transformation, their rejection of Nazism, their belief in reconciliation, to those years behind the wire. As one former prisoner wrote in a letter to his American guard, "In your country, I learned that strength and kindness can live together. That was my education in democracy." By 1947, the last of the German POWs had been repatriated. The camps were dismantled, the barracks sold for lumber, the fences taken down. Grass grew over the parade grounds where laughter had once startled the watchtowers. Yet the echoes of that laughter remained, in the memories of men who had found, in the unlikeliest place, a glimpse of humanity during the darkest war in history. But while some carried home lessons of compassion, others carried guilt. The moral reckoning with what Germany had done, and what they had ignored, would haunt them for the rest of their lives, because soon after their return, the full horror of the Nazi regime would be revealed to the world. The concentration camps, the mass graves, the crimes committed in their name. And for many former POWs who had laughed so freely behind American barbed wire, that knowledge would change everything. When the last transport ships left American shores in 1947, the era of German POWs in the United States quietly ended. The camps were dismantled, the fences torn down, and the laughter that had once floated across the fields of Texas, Oklahoma, and Arizona was swallowed by silence. But the story did not end there. What remained was memory, and the question that haunted both sides: what had truly happened behind those fences? For the Americans, the POW program became one of the most unexpected human success stories of the war. Against the backdrop of global carnage, these camps had shown that the U.S. could hold its enemies without hate. Guards, farmers, and townspeople who had feared Nazi soldiers discovered instead ordinary men, disciplined, polite, even grateful. Communities that had once protested the camp's construction later missed their presence when the prisoners were gone. The fields seemed quieter, the towns a little emptier. In Texas, former guards and locals spoke of the gentle Germans who built barns, played violins, and carved wooden toys for their children. Many of those toys survived long after the barracks were gone, silent artifacts of an unlikely peace. But the true legacy of these camps went beyond nostalgia. It lived in the moral transformation of the men who had been prisoners. For thousands of German POWs, their years in America became a mirror, one that reflected everything their homeland had lost. They saw a society that valued law, freedom, and individual dignity. They learned that democracy wasn't weakness. It was discipline of another kind. Inside the fences, they had laughed freely. Outside, their country had been consumed by fanaticism and destruction. The contrast struck deep. Historians later described the POW experience as the quietest re-education of the German mind. There were no propaganda films, no forced confessions, only exposure to ordinary decency. When those men returned to a broken Germany, many carried those lessons home. Some became teachers, engineers, or community leaders in the new Federal Republic. Others joined post-war peace movements, determined to ensure that Germany would never again be ruled by ideology. A number of them even maintained lifelong friendships with their former guards. Letters continued for decades, filled with reflections on the absurdity of it all. How enemies had shared laughter across wire. How captivity had taught freedom. One such letter, found in the archives of Camp Hearn's museum, reads, "You gave us more than food and safety. You showed us who we could have been, and who we still might be." For the United States, too, the legacy endured. The POW program became a quiet chapter in the country's moral self-understanding. a reminder that how one treats the defeated matters as much as victory itself. The Americans had every reason for revenge. News of Nazi atrocities by 1945 was filling newspapers. The photos from Buchenwald and Dachau left no room for illusion. Yet even as those horrors came to light, the guards in Texas, Oklahoma, and Arizona continued to treat their German captives humanely, refusing to mirror the cruelty of the regime those men had once served. That restraint, historians argue, helped shape America's post-war image, not just as a victor, but as a nation guided by principle. Still, the paradox remained. How could there have been laughter, joy, even happiness, while millions were dying overseas? For some former POWs, that question became unbearable. In memoirs written decades later, they expressed guilt for having found comfort while their compatriots suffered, and for not knowing, or not wanting to know, what crimes had been committed in their country's name. One wrote simply, "We laughed in America while our people burned in Germany. That is the truth I cannot forget." And yet, perhaps that contradiction was the essence of humanity itself, the capacity to seek normalcy even in captivity, to create art and humor amid ruin. In the small towns of Texas and the plains of Oklahoma, traces of that story still remain. Some camp foundations lie hidden under weeds. A few guard towers stand, half-collapsed, relics of an era when enemies shared a fragile truce in the heart of America. Local museums now preserve those memories, faded photographs of soccer matches, sketches of guards drawn by German artists, letters written in both English and broken German. They tell a story not of victory or defeat, but of recognition that beneath the uniforms, the languages, and the war, men remained men, and somewhere in that recognition, in that laughter that once echoed louder than the guards' own voices, lay the beginning of a different kind of peace. Because when the last prisoners left, they carried more than memories of comfort or kindness. They carried proof that humanity, once given space, could outlive ideology. The barbed wire was gone. The laughter had faded, but what it left behind, understanding, reconciliation, and the faint echo of shared humanity, would ripple across generations. The war had divided nations, but in those strange sunlit camps on American soil, something remarkable had happened. Enemies had learned quietly how to stop being enemies. Decades have passed. The fences are gone. The fields where the camps once stood are silent now, overgrown with grass, marked only by weathered plaques and the faint outlines of forgotten barracks. But if you listen closely on a still Texas morning, you might almost hear it, the echo of voices, the sound of men laughing in a place built for war. It remains one of the quietest paradoxes of the Second World War, that in the heart of America, in barbed wire enclosures meant for enemies, some of the most human moments of the war unfolded. The POW camps were never intended to change hearts or rewrite ideologies. They were meant to contain, to manage, to hold until the war was done. And yet, by accident or grace, they became small laboratories of humanity, where mercy replaced vengeance, and laughter became resistance against despair. For the American guards, it was a lesson in empathy. For the German prisoners, it was a revelation that dignity and kindness could exist even from one's enemy. In the years that followed, many of those men never forgot. Some returned to visit the sites where they had once been held. They walked freely through open fields that had once confined them, sometimes side by side with the guards who had once watched over them. They spoke softly, laughed again, and wondered how such unlikely friendships had survived the passage of time. There was no monument to those friendships, no medals, no ceremonies, just memories carried quietly by two generations who had seen the worst of war, and by chance glimpsed its opposite. In a conflict defined by hate, they had discovered something rare, understanding. And in a world that had taught them to see each other as enemies, they had learned, in captivity. Of all places, that compassion could be stronger than fear. That is why the story of the German POWs in America endures, not as a tale of war, but as a testament to what survives it. Because long after the gunfire stopped, long after the fences fell, one truth remained, that even in the darkest of wars, laughter could still belong to men who remembered how to be human.